Hello everyone, this is Umesh Agrawal and in this video we are going to study about the cranial nerves and the cranial nerve nuclei. So first of all, we all know that there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves in our body and there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So today what we are going to discuss is about the cranial nerves and how are they related to their respective cranial nuclei, the relation to the brainstem and how do they exit through the base of the skull through various foramens. Now, before starting towards the cranial nerves, I would first like to give you an overview about. Now, for suppose, consider this as the head of a person, which we are viewing from the superior side. So, here will lie the nose. This is the anterior or the ventral portion of the body. This is the posterior or the dorsal portion of the body. So, here will lie the nose. Here will lie the ears. Now, when we open up the skull, this will be the seat of the pituitary gland called as the sella turcica. And there are bony projections which divide the entire cranial fossa into three parts. This is the anterior cranial fossa, this is the middle cranial fossa, and this is the posterior cranial fossa. On viewing from the lateral side, we will come to know that this is, for example, this is the skull of a head of a person. So the entire brain will lie like this. This is the brain. So this will be the anterior cranial fossa. This will be the anterior cranial fossa. This will be the middle cranial fossa, and this will be the posterior cranial fossa. Right? And here lies the nose. This is the nose. This will be the nasal cavity. So here, this part of the brain is called the cribriform plate. So let us start with the first cranial nerve, that is the olfactory nerve. Now let us start with the first cranial nerve, that is the olfactory nerve. Now just imagine that there is food placed in front of you or someone has gifted you a flower. So when you want to appreciate the smell of the food or the flower, what do? You inspire it forcefully. You sniff it. Why do you sniff it? Because the olfactory epithelium lies in the upper part of the nasal cavity. Right. So for the air to reach in this upper part of the nasal cavity, we have to sniff it hard, and here is located the olfactory epithelium. When we breathe, most of the air passes through the middle area of the nasal cavity. But to be able to appreciate the smell, we have to make the air reach up to the olfactory epithelium, and that is why we have to sniff or take the air forcefully. Now, from this olfactory epithelium, this is the base of the skull, and here is the nasal cavity. These are the external layers. This will be the cribriform plate, right? So here is the olfactory epithelium. Now from the olfactory epithelium, will arise olfactory nerves. Now these olfactory nerves are bipolar nerves, that is, they have one axon and they have one process, right? So the olfactory nerves will be like, this is the cribriform plate, this is the magnified view, we are viewing this portion here. This is the cribriform plate in which there lies many apertures, many holes, many foramens, and this is the olfactory epithelium. So these bipolar neurons, this is the bipolar neuron, this is the axon, and this is the dendritic process. So from these the foramen in the cribriform plate, the olfactory nerves will attach the olfactory epithelium to the olfactory bulb lying just over the cribriform plate. This is another olfactory nerve, which is a bipolar nerve. This is the axonal process, and this is the dendritic process. This is another olfactory nerve which has axonal process and the dendritic process. So what does these olfactory nerves do? They attach the olfactory epithelium through the bipolar nerve to the olfactory bulb. Now in the olfactory bulb there lies some cells. This is the olfactory nerve, bipolar olfactory nerves. This is the axonal process. This is the dendritic process. Now here lies another mitral cells. These are called as mitral cells. Here is another mitral cell, here is the mitral cell, here are other. So all these together form the mitral cells, which carry forward the sensations to the olfactory tract. That means the sensation from the olfactory bulb are carried to the central nervous system via the olfactory tract. Now, where does this olfactory tract carry the sensations to? It carries to the center, that is the central nervous system. But which part of the central nervous system? It carries the sensation mainly to the temporal lobe, the primary olfactory cortex. The olfactory tract carries the sensations from the mitral cells to the central nervous system. Which part of the central nervous system? To the temporal lobe, where lies the primary olfactory cortex, in the inferomedial area. So the inferior medial area of the temporal lobe is known as the primary olfactory cortex, to which the olfactory tract carries the sensations to. Now, as we all know that another name for cerebrum is telencephalon. So what can we say? That the olfactory nerves are attached to the telencephalon. The end structures, that is the sensations, are carried in the central nervous system to the telencephalon, right? So now we proceed towards our next cranial nerve, that is the optic nerve. Now this is the part of the midbrain. Okay. So this is the brainstem, this is the midbrain, this is the pons, and this is the medulla. Okay, as we all know that the brainstem is comprised of three components, which is the midbrain, the pons, and the ending, and at the end we have the medulla. Okay, so now above the midbrain lie the thalamus, and let us draw here the eyeball, the retinal portion of the eyeball. So this is the retina, and as we know that the optic nerve is a continuation of the retina. Okay, so this will be the optic nerve, which crosses over the nasal portion of the optic nerve, crosses over and enters the opposite cortex, whereas the temporal part of the optic nerve enters the same cortex. If this is the left eye, the temporal part, this is the nasal part, so this will enter the same cortex, whereas the nasal portion will enter the opposite cortex. And this point where this crossing over is taking place, it is called as the optic chiasma. And after this optic chiasma, this is called as the optic tract. Now, where does this optic tract end? It ends in the thalamus, which further carries the sensations towards the visual cortex through the optic radiation. So, where does this optic nerve end? We can say that this is the thalamus, and thalamus is also known as diencephalon. So we can say that the olfactory nerve is connected to the telencephalon, whereas the optic nerve is connected to the diencephalon. Now, all the cranial nerves, from the 3rd cranial nerve to the 12th cranial nerve, all these 10 nerves arise from the brainstem. Okay, only the first and second cranial nerve, this is the first cranial nerve and this is the second cranial nerve, only these are the two cranial nerves that arise from above the brainstem. So now when we look at all the 12 cranial nerves together, let me write it down as all these 12 cranial nerves. We can say that the top 4 cranial nerves arise from the medulla, from the midbrain or above the midbrain. Which are the cranial nerves arising from above the midbrain? The first and second. And the third and fourth cranial nerves leave the brainstem through the midbrain. Cranial nerves 5 to 8 leave the brainstem through the pontine region, and the 9, 10, 11, 12 leave the brainstem through the medulla. This is easy to remember. 1, 2, 3, 4, they leave the brainstem through the midbrain or the upper portion of the midbrain. 5, 6, 7, 8, they leave the brainstem through the pontine area. 9, 10, 11 and 12 leave the brainstem from the medulla. Now before viewing the cranial nerves, their relation to the brainstem, that is from the third cranial nerve to the 12th cranial nerve, their relations to the brainstem, we will first see the view of the brainstem anteriorly, posteriorly and from the fronto-superior part. Right? Now when viewed posteriorly, it will look something like this. This will be the midbrain portion. The midbrain is having two colliculi, the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus. This is the level of the superior colliculus. This is the inferior colliculus. Now below the midbrains will lie the pons. This is the pons and this is the medulla. Now behind the pons and medulla will lie the cerebellum. This is the midbrain. When viewed from the anterior aspect, the brainstem will look something like this. This is the view of the brainstem from the anterior aspect. This will be the midbrain at the superior colliculus level. This will be the inferior colliculus. This will be the pons, and this is the medulla. Now, as you can see, there are a number of swellings in the medulla. The center swellings are called as the pyramid, whereas the swelling lying just lateral to it is called the olive. There will be one more olivary swelling lateral to the left pyramidal area behind this pyramid. Okay, so now when we view it from the fronto-posterior aspect, the structures look something like this. This will be the midbrain at the level of superior colliculi. This will be at the level of inferior colliculi. This will be the pons, and this will be the medulla oblongata. Now, the third nerve. The third nerve is the oculomotor nerve. The third nerve is the oculomotor nerve. This oculomotor nerve will arise from the superior colliculus. Its nucleus lies just in the periaqueductal area, and from this nuclei will arise the third nerve. It exits the membrane from the anterior portion of the interpedicular fossa. These are the peduncles. This will be the right peduncle, this will be the left peduncle, and between these two peduncles will lie the interpedicular fossa. So from the interpedicular fossa leaves the third nerve, that is the oculomotor nerve. Now the fourth nerve leaves the midbrain from the posterior aspect of the midbrain at the level of the inferior colliculi. This is the structure of the midbrain at the level of inferior colliculi. This is the aqueductal space, this is the periaqueductal area from where will arise the fourth nerve, that is the trochlear nerve, and it crosses over like this. So the root of the fourth nerve is from the posterior aspect to the anterior aspect. If you view it in the frontal superior view, it will arise from here, it will cross here, and it will come in the posterior view like this. This will be the fourth nerve. This was the third cranial nerve. Right, so we had seen that the 1, 2, 3 and 4 arises from the midbrain or above the midbrain. We had seen that the first nerve was attached to the telencephalon, the second nerve was attached to the diencephalon. Now the third nerve leaves the midbrain from the interpedicular fossa or the anterior aspect. The fourth nerve leaves the midbrain from the level of the inferior colliculus posteriorly and then comes anteriorly. Right, now the fifth, sixth, seventh and eighth, they arise from the pontine region. Right, so this is the pons, this is the medulla, this will be the pontomedullary junction. Right, this is the pons. So from the mid-pontine region arises the fifth nerve. Now as we all know, fifth nerve is a mixed type of nerve. Right, that means it will have both sensory component and motor component. So this part is the sensory component, whereas another part, that is the motor component, lies just beneath it. So likewise, it will be on the opposite side also. This will be the trigeminal nerve, the sensory portion of the trigeminal nerve, and this will be the motor portion of the trigeminal nerve. Right. Now this trigeminal nerve attaches to the trigeminal ganglia, and from this trigeminal ganglia arises three branches of the trigeminal nerve, that is the ophthalmic branch, the maxillary branch, and the mandibular branch. The motor component of this trigeminal nerve travels along with the mandibular branch of the sensory part of trigeminal nerve. Right, so we have the sensory component, we have the motor component. The motor component will travel along the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve, and the ophthalmic and the maxillary nerve are pure sensory branches that have a different route altogether. So we have seen the exit of the trigeminal nerve from the central pontine region. Now the sixth, seventh and eighth, they arise from the pontomedullary junction. The medial most being the sixth nerve, just lateral to it will be the seventh nerve, and the most lateral portion will be of the eighth nerve. So this is the eighth nerve, this is the seventh nerve, and this is the sixth nerve. Likewise on the opposite side, sixth, seventh, and this will be the eighth. So from the pontomedullary junction arise three nerves, which is the sixth nerve, seventh nerve, and the eighth nerve. The most medial nerve being the sixth, and the most lateral nerve being the eighth, and seventh nerve lies between the sixth nerve and the eighth nerve. Right, so we have seen up till now that the third nerve arises from the level of the superior colliculi and exits the brainstem from the interpedicular fossa. The fourth nerve exits the midbrain from at the level of the inferior colliculi posteriorly and then comes in anteriorly. The fifth nerve leaves the brainstem from the pontine region. It divides into three sensory branches from the trigeminal ganglia, which is the ophthalmic branch, the maxillary branch, and the mandibular branch, and this motor component travels along the mandibular branch. The sixth nerve, seventh nerve, and the eighth nerve leave the brainstem from the pontomedullary junction, sixth nerve being the most medial, eighth nerve being the most lateral, and the seventh nerve lying between the sixth and eighth. Right. So now we proceed forward towards the medulla part. In the medulla, we all know there are swellings. Right, there are four swellings. This is the midline, this is the swelling of the pyramid, this is the swelling of the olives. Right, this is the olive. Now our main concern here is about the olives. So there are four swellings, right? So on each side there will be two swellings, one of the pyramid and one of the olive. Now when we consider only olive, the sulcus between the pyramid and the olive will be the pre-olivary sulcus. This will be the pre-olivary sulcus. And the sulcus lateral to the olivary nucleus, olivary swelling, olivary colliculus will be the post-olivary sulcus. When we draw a magnified view of the medulla itself, it will look something like this. This is the pontomedullary junction from which will arise three nerves, 6th, 7th and 8th. This is the 6th nerve, this is the 7th nerve, and this is the 8th nerve. This is the midline. This will be the pyramidal swelling, pyramidal colliculus. This will be the olivary colliculus. Right? This is the pyramid, this is the olivary. So this will be the pre-olivary sulcus. So from the post-olivary sulcus will arise three nerves, which are the 9th nerve, the 10th nerve, and the 11th nerve. And from the pre-olivary sulcus will arise the 12th nerve. This will be the 12th nerve, which is the hypoglossal nerve. Similarly, on the opposite side, this is the 9th, the 10th, the 11th, and this is the 12th nerve, hypoglossal nerve. So up till now we have seen that the first cranial nerve is attached to the telencephalon. The second cranial nerve is attached to the diencephalon. The third nerve leaves from the midbrain at the level of the superior colliculus from the interpedicular fossa. The fourth cranial nerve leaves the midbrain at the level of the inferior colliculus posteriorly and then travels anteriorly. The fifth leaves from the pons, the central part. The 6th, 7th and 8th leave from the pontomedullary junction. The 9th, 10th, 11th and 12th leave from the medulla, of which the 9, 10 and 11 leave from the post-olivary sulcus and the 12th nerve leaves from the pre-olivary sulcus. Right? So now we have seen the relation of all the cranial nerves with the brainstem and with the central nervous system. Right? So now what we are going to do, we are going to see how these cranial nerves exit the cranial cavity. I had shown you earlier that this is the cranial cavity in which lies the brain. This will be the anticranial fossa, the middle cranial fossa, and this will be the posterior cranial fossa. Now below it will lie the brainstem. Okay, this will be the pons, the cerebellum, the medulla, and which continues down as the spinal cord by leaving it through the foramen magnum. So right. So now these cranial nerves arising from the brainstem and the telencephalon or the diencephalon will have to leave the cranial cavity from the base of the skull. So in the base of the skull will lie many apertures. Now from these apertures the cranial nerves will leave and they will innervate the peripheral structures. Right? For example, this is the nerves that will come from the brainstem, and this will pierce the base of the skull and will innervate their peripheral structures. Right? So what are these foramens? Which are the foramens that these cranial nerves lead through? So now here we will have to apply some logic only, and it's very easy to remember. The first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 and 12. Now we all know that this is the first nerve is the olfactory nerve. Olfactory nerve leads through the cribriform plate. Right? Everybody has understood this. Now the second nerve is the optic nerve. Optic nerve, which means it has to travel to the eye, so it should lead through the optic canal. This one was also easy. Now the third nerve, the fourth nerve and the sixth nerve. What are these nerves? These nerves supply the extraocular muscles of the eye. So to supply the extraocular nerve, the extraocular muscles of the eyes, they will have to leave the cranial cavity through the superior orbital fissure. Right? The first nerve leads through the cribriform plate, the second nerve leads through the optic canal, and the third, fourth and sixth lead through the superior orbital fissure to supply the extraocular muscles. Right? Now the fifth nerve. The fifth nerve has three branches: the ophthalmic division, the maxillary division, and the mandibular division. This ophthalmic, as the name suggests, is it is also this ophthalmic division. This ophthalmic division, as the name suggests, it is also related with the eye. That means it also will have to leave through the superior orbital fissure. The maxillary division leaves the cranial cavity from the foramen rotundum, and the mandibular branch leaves through the foramen ovale. Right. So now we have seen the cranial nerves from first to sixth and how do they exit the cranial cavity from which foramen. The seventh and eighth nerve. The seventh and eighth nerve leave the cranial cavity from the internal acoustic meatus. Where does this lead to? It leads to the inner ear. Right. So the inner ear is connected from to the cranial cavity through the internal acoustic meatus, from where the seventh and eighth nerve arise. Right. The 9th, 10th and 11th nerve leave the cranial cavity from the foramen from the jugular foramen. And the 12th cranial nerve leaves it through the hypoglossal canal. So when we see it diagrammatically, it will look something like this. This is the cribriform plate. Here will lie the optic canal. Lateral to the optic canal we have the superior orbital fissure, lateral to which we have this foramen rotundum, and here is the foramen ovale. This is the superior orbital fissure, lateral to which we have the foramen rotundum, and this is foramen ovale. Here we have the foramen magnum, from which the medulla enters the body as spinal cord, and here we have the hypoglossal canal. This is the jugular foramen, and this is the internal acoustic meatus, which is connected to the inner ear from the external acoustic. This is the external acoustic meatus. This is the internal acoustic meatus. Right. So here we have the trigeminal ganglia. The trigeminal ganglia has three divisions, which is the ophthalmic division, which passes through the superior orbital fissure, the maxillary division, which passes from the foramen rotundum, and the mandibular division, which passes from the foramen ovale. Okay. This is the optic canal through which passes the optic nerve. This is the cribriform plate from which passes the olfactory nerve. This is the internal acoustic meatus, the 7th nerve and the 8th nerve. The 9th, 10th, 11th cranial nerve pass through the jugular foramen, and this is the exit point of 12th nerve, which is the hypoglossal canal. Right. Now the 3rd, 4th and 6th also pass through this superior orbital fissure. So the total structures passing through the superior orbital fissure are 3rd nerve, 4th nerve, 6th nerve, and the 5th A branch. 5th A branch is the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve. Right. So now we have seen the structures, the cranial nerves in relation with the brainstem, and how do they exit from the cranial cavity. Right. So having seen the relations with the brainstem and their exit from the cranial cavity, now we are going to look in the cranial nerve nuclei portion. Right. Which are the cranial nerve nuclei and how are they related to the respective nerve? For that, we have to keep in mind one thing, and that is that one nerve may have many nuclei or more than one nuclei. One nuclei can be associated with more than one nerve. Okay, this is the basic concept we have to remember. It is not like there will be only one nuclei for one nerve and one nuclei will be associated only with one nerve. No, they can be associated with more than one nerve also. So now, having understood this basic concept, we move to the cranial nerve nuclei portion of our lecture. For that, we will have to first see the spinal cord segment. This is the head-shaped gray matter. The posterior segment will have the alar plates, and the anterior segment will have the basal plates. This is the alar plate, which is mainly sensory. This is the basal plates, which is mainly motor. So the fibers will come from the central nervous system. They will reach this motor area of the gray matter and they will leave as efferents. Now, for the confusion of afferent and efferent, we have a solution, which is we have to remember the English alphabets. What do? We write it as A, B, C, D, E. Right? So we are going from A to E. So the nerve signal will also travel along A to E. So A means the afferent nerves, which are mainly sensory. These are the first part of the signal transmission, and this is the efferent nerve, which should be motor. That means they supply the signal from the central nervous system to the periphery, right? So afferent nerve is a sensory nerve, efferent nerve is a motor nerve. How can we remember this? By remembering the English alphabets, right? So here we'll have the efferent nerves and here we'll have the sensory nerves. That is the afferent nerves. So where does this motor nerve end? They end to the somatic, that is all the voluntary muscles for the motor activity, or the involuntary muscles like the viscera, which is the peristaltic movement or the sphincter movements, right? So we have the general somatic efferents, which will supply, for example, the extraocular muscles. The extraocular muscles are voluntary movements, so they must have a motor supply. This motor supply is known as the general somatic efferent. Now, what will we call the efferent supply to visceral organs such as the esophagus, responsible for the peristaltic movement or the sphincter movements? This will be called as the visceral efferent, and these are general. They are present all over the body, so it will be called as general visceral efferent. So there is a special gray matter nuclei lying just lateral to the general somatic efferent, which give fibers known as the general visceral efferent. The gray matter, from the gray matter will arise the gray matter, from the sensory part of the gray matter, the nerve fiber take the signal from the receptor organs to the center, right? So we'll have the general somatic efferent, the general somatic afferents that will carry the sensations from the afferent, from the somites, that is from all the skin, the touch, pain, temperature, proprioception. All the sensation will be carried from the body to the center via the general somatic afferent. Similarly, we'll have some nerve fibers responsible for taking these sensations from the viscera to the central nervous system, for which we'll have general visceral afferents. So now we can see that in the most medial portion we have the general somatic efferent, and as we go laterally we have the general somatic afferent, right? So in the spinal cord we have the arrangement looking something like this. This is the midline. This is the general somatic efferent. This is the general visceral efferent. This is the general visceral afferent. And this, the most lateral, will be the general somatic afferent. Similarly on this side, from the medial to lateral, we will have general somatic efferent, general visceral efferent, general visceral afferent, and the general somatic afferent. Right? So in the spinal cord we have the arrangement like this. Now when we go into the brainstem portion, in the brainstem portion we have some additional nuclei which are known as the special we have 3 nuclei total for the motor nuclei. We have seen that in the from the spinal cord we have the general somatic efferents, we have the general visceral efferents. Now we have a set of muscles in our head and neck region, a set of muscles in our head and neck region which are arising from the pharyngeal arches. Now the muscles arising from the pharyngeal arches are not present throughout the body. They are only present in the head and neck, which means they are special muscles, right? They have a special origin, which means that the efferent to these fibers should also have a special bundle of nerve fibers, which is called as special visceral efferent, right? So we have a third nuclei in the brainstem which is known as a special visceral efferent, which carries the sensations or the motor command to the muscles developed from the pharyngeal arches. Now which are the muscles developed from the pharyngeal arches? We have 5 pharyngeal arches: first, second, third, fourth and sixth. The first pharyngeal arches develop the muscles of mastication. The second gives rise to the facial expression. The third, fourth and fifth are related to the laryngeal and pharyngeal muscles. Okay, so these set of muscles have different a special nerve fiber bundle which is called as the somatic visceral afferent that carry the sensation from the center to the muscles arising from the pharyngeal arches, right? Now similarly in the sensory component we will have 4 nuclei. The first nuclei, as we had seen in the spinal cord segment, was general visceral afferent and general somatic afferent. Right now, we have some special organs in our head and neck region which are not present all over the body, which are, for example, the tongue. This is a visceral organ which is responsible for the sensation of taste. This is a special type of sensation, so which must be innervated by a special type of nerve that will be called as special, which is this organ visceral or somatic. This is visceral, so special visceral. And what are these carrying taste sensations, which is a sensory, which means afferent, so this will be special visceral afferent. Now similarly, as a special visceral afferent, we have something like special somatic afferents. Now which are the special somatic afferent? Hearing and balance. Now hearing and balance, these sensations are not present throughout the body. They can only be performed by the ear. Okay, so these are also some special sensations that can be only performed by the ear and not throughout the body. So these also must be innervated by some special fibers which are known as special somatic afferents. Afferent means sensory component, and special means because it only happens in the head and neck region and not throughout the body. Right. So now we know that total in the brainstem there are 7 types of nuclei. This is the midline, 3 motor which lie medially, and 4 sensory which lie laterally. The most medial being the general somatic efferent. Lateral to it we have the special somatic efferent which supplies the muscles of mastication, the facial expression, and then we have the general visceral efferent. Right, efferent means the motor component. The sensory. Now sensory we have 4 nuclei. The most medial being the general visceral afferent. Lateral to it we have the special somatic afferent. Then we have the general somatic afferent. And the most lateral is the special somatic afferent. Right, the general visceral afferent carries the sensations to the from the taste to the central nervous system, and the special somatic afferent carry the sensations from the hearing or that is the cochlea and the vestibular part to the central nervous system. Right, so now we have seen that there are 4 types of nuclei, and now we are going to see how these cranial nuclei are related to the cranial nerves. This is the midbrain. This is the pons, this is the medulla, and below it we have the spinal cord. Right? This is the midline. So now the most medial side we have general somatic. In the most middle part we have the general somatic efferent, right? So what are the general somatic efferent? We have the third nerve nuclei at the level of the fourth, at the level of superior colliculus, and we have the fourth nerve nuclei at the level of the inferior colliculus, right? The third nerve and the fourth nerve. In the pons, we have the sixth nerve nuclei. What I had explained to you was that general somatic efferent. I had given you the example of extraocular muscles. These extraocular muscles are supplied by which nerves? The third nerve, the fourth nerve, and the sixth nerve. And so we'll have the third nerve, the fourth nerve, and the sixth nerve nucleus in the general somatic efferent. Along which we'll have the 12th nerve nucleus, which will supply the hypoglossal muscles. So in the general somatic efferent part, we will have four nuclei: the third nerve nuclei, fourth nerve nuclei, sixth nerve nuclei, and the 12th nerve nuclei. The third, fourth, sixth travel to the extraocular muscles, and the 12th travels to the hypoglossal muscles. Right. So now we have seen that in the general somatic efferent we will have four nuclei: third, fourth, sixth, and 12th. Lateral to the general somatic efferent we have general visceral efferent. In the general visceral efferent we have first the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, which is responsible for the parasympathetic supply to the sphincter pupillae and the ciliaris muscle. Right? So the nerve fibers arising from the third nerve nuclei and the Edinger-Westphal nucleus are together carried through the third nerve, that is the oculomotor nerve. Okay, the third nerve carries to the nerve fibers arising from the motor nuclei of the third nerve gives innervation to the extraocular muscles, whereas the nerve fibers arising from the Edinger-Westphal nucleus of the third nerve gives fibers to the sphincter pupillae and the ciliaris muscle. The fourth nerve, it only innervates the extraocular muscle, which is the SO4L6, that means the superior oblique muscle. The sixth nerve, it innervates only the lateral rectus muscle, and the 12th nerve, it innervates the hypoglossal muscles. So in the general visceral efferent we have seen the first nuclei, which is the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Now in the pontine region we have two more nuclei, which is the superior salivatory nucleus and the inferior salivatory nucleus. This is the inferior salivatory nucleus and this is the superior salivatory nucleus. The superior salivatory nucleus is divided into two parts. The below is the superior salivatory nucleus and the above portion is called as the lacrimetal nucleus. Right, and in the medullary portion we have the dorsal nucleus of vagus, which is the biggest nucleus in the general visceral efferent. The dorsal nucleus of vagus. Now, from the name itself we can understand these nuclei will be innervated by the 10th nerve. Okay, so now in the general visceral efferent we have seen that there are four nuclei: the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, the superior salivatory nucleus, which is divided into two parts, the upper part being the lacrimetal nucleus and the lower part being the superior salivatory nucleus, below which we have the inferior salivatory nucleus, and below the inferior salivatory nucleus in the medullary part we have the dorsal nucleus of vagus, which will be innervated by the 10th nerve. Right, the superior salivatory nucleus and the lacrimetal nucleus, the fibers arising from these two nuclei will be carried by the 7th nerve, and the fibers arising from the inferior salivatory nucleus will be carried by the 9th nerve. The fibers arising from the lacrimetal nucleus will go to the pterygopalatine ganglion, will go to the pterygopalatine. From the parasympathetic ganglion, it innervates the lacrimetal apparatus and also the hard palate along with the nasociliary. Right. From the superior salivatory nucleus, we have the fibers reaching to the submandibular ganglion, and from the submandibular ganglion, it will supply the submandibular gland. From the inferior salivatory nucleus, we have the fibers which are carried by the 9th nerve. They will go to the otic ganglion, and from the otic ganglion they will innervate the parotid gland. The dorsal nucleus of vagus. The dorsal nucleus of vagus carries the parasympathetic supply to almost all of the body, starting from the esophagus, the trachea, heart, lungs, whole of the GIT system, that is the stomach, intestine. All the parasympathetic innervation to all these organs will be given by the vagus nerve, which have the fibers arising from the dorsal nucleus of vagus. And the third component of the motor system, we have the special visceral efferent. In the special visceral efferent, we have two nuclei, the fifth nerve nuclei and the seventh nerve nuclei. The fifth nerve nuclei carries innervation to the muscles arising from the first brachial arch, that is the muscles of mastication. And from the seventh nerve, we have the fibers arising that innervate the muscles of facial expression. These are the muscles of first brachial arch, and this is the muscles of second brachial arch. So now we have seen in detail the cranial nerves, which are related to the general somatic efferent nuclei, the general visceral efferent nuclei, and the special visceral efferent nuclei. Now we move on to the sensory part. So now we are going to see the sensory nuclei. We have seen the motor nuclei, the general somatic efferent we have seen, the general visceral efferent we have seen, and the special visceral efferents we have seen. The general efferent nuclei had the third cranial nerve nuclei, the fourth cranial nerve nuclei, the sixth one, and the 12th. The third, fourth, sixth supplied the extraocular muscles, whereas the 12th supplied the hypoglossal muscles. In the general visceral efferent, we had the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, just lateral to the third nerve nuclei. Then we had the lacrimetry nucleus and the superior salivatory nucleus carried by the seventh nerve fibers. Then we had the inferior salivatory nucleus carried by the ninth nerve fibers, and then we had the dorsal nucleus of vagus. In the special visceral efferent, we had two nuclei, the fifth nerve nuclei and the seventh nerve nuclei, which supplied the muscles from the first brachial arch and the second brachial arch respectively. Right. So now we are going to see the sensory part, the sensory nuclei. So in the sensory nuclei, we had already seen there were four nuclei, 1, 2, 3, 4. The most medial was the general visceral afferent. Lateral to it was the special visceral afferent. Lateral to which we had the general somatic afferent, and the most lateral was special somatic afferent. The general visceral afferent carried the sensations from all the viscera of the body to the CNS. The special visceral afferent carried the sensation of taste. The general somatic afferents carried the touch, pain, temperature, and proprioception from all over the body. And the special somatic afferents carried the hearing and balance. Right. So here we have the general visceral afferent. So in the sensory nuclei, when we study the sensory nuclei, we have to remember that the nuclei for the general visceral afferent and the special visceral afferent, they are common. They have a common nuclei, which is known as the nucleus tractus solitarius. Nucleus tractus solitarius. Now, how does this nucleus tractus solitarius look like? The nucleus tractus solitarius is divided into four parts, that is the superior part, the inferior part, and the medial part is divided into two parts, the lateral side and the medial side. So this is the superior part, this is the inferior part, this is the lateral medial, and this is the middle medial. Now this superior part of the nucleus tractus solitarius is responsible for the taste sensation. The middle medial part is responsible for the sensations from the carotid body and the carotid sinus. Whereas the lateral medial part is responsible for the sensations from the lungs. And the inferior part receives sensations from all of the viscera from the body. Okay, so this is the nucleus tractus solitarius. Nucleus tractus solitarius is divided into four parts: the superior, the lateromedial, the medial, and the inferior part. The superior part of the nucleus tractus solitarius is the nuclei for the taste sensations. The lateral medial part is responsible for the sensations from the lungs. The middle medial part is responsible for the sensations arising from the carotid body and the carotid sinus, which measures the pressure changes, and the rest of the viscera uh, sensations are carried to the inferior part of the nucleus tractus solitarius. Right here we had the nucleus ambiguous in the special visceral afferent, which was responsible for the motor innervation of the brachial arches. The ninth, 10th, and 11th nerve carried the motor sensations towards the brachial arches of the third, fourth, and fifth. So the muscles developed from the third, fourth, and fifth brachial arches. Right. So now this nucleus tractus solitarius, which we have seen just minutes ago, is located somewhat here. This is the nucleus tractus solitarius. The superior part, the lateromedial, the middle medial, and this is the inferior part. So the general visceral afferent and the special visceral afferent have a common nuclei that is known as the nucleus tractus solitarius. The upper part of the nucleus tractus solitarius, that is the superior part, is the nuclei for the taste sensation. The lateromedial is the nuclei for receiving sensations from the respiratory system, that is the lungs. The middle medial part receives the sensations from the carotid body or the carotid sinus, and the inferior part is the nuclei for the rest of the viscera of the body. Now we are going to see this general somatic afferent. General somatic afferent. Here was general visceral afferent plus special visceral afferent. In the general somatic afferent, we have a large nuclei. This is the fifth nerve nuclei. This fifth nerve nuclei, that is the trigeminal nuclei, is spread all over the brainstem. That is in the midbrain, in the pons, in the medulla. So the midbrain portion of the trigeminal nerve is known as the mesencephalic part. Mesencephalic part of the trigeminal nuclei. The pontine portion is also called as the primary trigeminal nuclei. And the medullary part is also called as the spinal part of the trigeminal nerve. This spinal part of the trigeminal nerve continues down into the spinal cord up to the first or second cervical segments. So this is the largest nuclei, the fifth nerve nuclei, which has three parts: the mesencephalic part, the primary trigeminal nuclei, and the spinal trigeminal nuclei. Right. So the mesencephalic part of the trigeminal nuclei receives the sensations of proprioception. So all the fibers coming from the trigeminal nuclei, which carry the sensations of proprioception, are transferred to the mesencephalic part. The primary trigeminal nuclei is responsible for the touch sensation, and the spinal part is responsible for the pain and temperature. So the fibers of trigeminal nerve carrying the sensations of pain and temperature are transferred to the spinal trigeminal nuclei. The fibers of the trigeminal nerve carrying the sensation of touch is carried to the primary trigeminal nuclei, and the fibers of the trigeminal nerve carrying the sensation of proprioception is forwarded to the mesencephalic part. So this is the trigeminal nuclei, which is spread all over the brainstem, that is the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. So in total, when we look at the fifth nuclei, when we look at the nucleus of the fifth nerve, that is the fifth nerve nuclei, in total we have these three parts, that is the mesencephalic part, the primary trigeminal nuclei, and the spinal trigeminal nuclei, which is a type of general somatic afferent. Plus we had a special visceral efferent which carried the motor component, the motor commands to the muscles developed from the first brachial arch. This one. This was the special visceral efferent nuclei which carried the motor commands to the muscles developed from the first brachial arch, that is the muscles of mastication, which was carried by the fifth nerve, that is the trigeminal nerve. So this is the motor component and this is the sensory component. What is the sensory component? The mesencephalic part, the primary trigeminal nuclei and the spinal trigeminal nuclei. These are the three parts of the sensory nuclei, and the motor nuclei lies in the special visceral area, special visceral efferent type of nuclei, which carries the sensations towards the first break, towards the muscles of the first brachial arch, that is the muscle of mastication. So we have seen the general visceral afferent, we have seen the special visceral afferent, we have seen the general somatic afferent, and now what remains is the special somatic afferent. The special somatic afferent, we have seen that the special somatic afferent carries the fibers of hearing and balance, that is the vestibulocochlear nerve. So the vestibulocochlear nerve, we have the vestibular nuclei, which is again divided into four parts: the superior, the inferior, the medial, and the lateral. These are the four parts of the vestibular nuclei, and then we have the cochlear nuclei. There are two cochlear nuclei. This is the dorsal cochlear nuclei, and this is the ventral cochlear nuclei. So the fibers from the vestibulocochlear nerve, the fibers arising from the cochlear portion will end up in the dorsal and the ventral cranial nuclei, whereas the fibers from the vestibular will end up in the vestibular nuclei, which are a type of special somatic afferents. So now we have seen all the motor nuclei and all the sensory nuclei. The motor nuclei were the general somatic efferents, which had the nuclei of the third nerve nuclei, the fourth nerve nuclei, the sixth nerve nuclei, and the 12th nerve nuclei. The third, fourth, and sixth supplied the extraocular muscles, whereas the 12th supplied the hypoglossal muscles. Then in the general visceral efferent, we had the Edinger Westphal nucleus, which was again carried by the third nerve. So the third nerve will have the fibers arising from the third nerve nuclei and the Edinger Westphal nucleus. Then the other nuclei we had seen in the general visceral efferent was the lacrimating nucleus. The lacrimating nucleus carries fibers to the pterygopalatine ganglion, which end up in the lacrimal apparatus, the nasociliary apparatus, and the heart palate. Then we had the superior salivating nucleus. The superior salivating nucleus was again carried by the seventh nerve, which carried it towards the submandibular ganglion and the sublingual ganglion. In the end, which supplied the submandibular gland and the sublingual gland. Then we had the inferior salivating nucleus. Inferior salivating nucleus fibers were carried by the ninth nerve, which carried it to the OT ganglion, and in the end it supplied the parotid gland. Then we had the largest nuclei of the general visceral afferent, that was the dorsal nucleus of vagus, which carried the parasympathetic supply to all the remaining viscera of the body. Then we had seen the special visceral afferent. In the special visceral afferent, we had seen three nuclei. The first one was the nuclei of the fifth nerve, which carried its innervation to the muscles developed from the first brachial arch, that is the muscle of mastication. Then the second nuclei was the nuclei of the seventh nerve, which carried its sensation towards the muscles developed from the second brachial arch, that is the muscles of facial expression. And in the end, we had the nucleus ambiguous. Nucleus ambiguous, the fibers were carried by the ninth nerve, the 10th nerve, and the 11th nerve to the third, fourth, and sixth brachial arches, that is the muscles of the larynx and pharynx. Then we had seen the general visceral afferent, the special visceral afferent. They have a common nuclei known as the nucleus tractus solitarius, the superior part of which is the nuclei of the taste. The inferior part receives the sensations from the rest of the viscera. The medial part receives the sensations from the carotid sinus or the carotid body, and the lateral medial receives its sensations from the respiratory system of the lungs. Then in the general somatic afferent, we have the trigeminal nuclei, which is spread all along the brainstem, and it ends in the upper cervical segments. The part of the trigeminal nuclei which lies in the midbrain is called as the mesencephalic part. The part of the trigeminal nuclei lying in the pons is the primary trigeminal nuclei, and the part of the trigeminal nuclei in the medulla and the upper cervical segments of the spinal cord is known as the spinal trigeminal nuclei. The mesencephalic part receives the fibers carrying the sensation of proprioception. The primary trigeminal nuclei is responsible for the sensation of touch, and the spinal trigeminal nuclei is the nuclei for receiving the sensations of pain and temperature from the body. And lastly, we had seen the special somatic afferent, which had three nuclei in total: one vestibular nuclei and two cochlear nuclei. The two cochlear nuclei were the dorsal cochlear nuclei and the ventral cochlear nuclei. The fibers from the vestibular cochlear nerve end up here. Right. So, having seen all this, we'll have a quick summary. Starting from the third nerve, we'll continue up to the 12th nerve, and we'll write down all the nuclei which are related to that particular nerve. What is the site of exit? What is this point of origin from the brainstem? Which are the ganglia if they are related to? And what is the type of that cranial nerve? And which are the end structures that are supplied by the cranial nerve? So first we'll start with the third cranial nerve. The third cranial nerve, that is the oculomotor nerve. The oculomotor nerve is related to the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, which was general visceral efferent, and the third nerve nucleus, which was general somatic efferent. Now the third nerve originates from the midbrain at the level of superior colliculi. They leave the cranial cavity through the superior orbital fissure. The fibers arising from the Edinger-Westphal nucleus supply the sphincter pupillae and the ciliaris muscle. The fibers arising from the motor third nerve nuclei supplies the extraocular muscles. All the extraocular muscles except for superior oblique and lateral rectus. Right? Now, the fibers from the Edinger-Westphal nucleus first reach the ciliary ganglion, and from there the fibers are carried towards the sphincter pupillae and the ciliaris muscle. Okay, so this was the summary of the total components of the third cranial nerve. Now the fourth cranial nerve. Fourth cranial nerve, which is the trochlear nerve. This trochlear nerve arises from the midbrain at the level of inferior colliculus. It exits posteriorly and then travels anteriorly. It is related only with one nuclei, that is the fourth nerve nuclei, which is a type of general somatic efferent. And it carries its fibers towards the superior oblique muscle, SO4 LR6. So this is the SO4 SO. Superior oblique is supplied by the fourth nuclei, the fourth nerve, that is the trochlear nerve, and it exits the cranial cavity through superior orbital fissure. Right. So now we have seen the third nerve and the fourth nerve and the nuclei which they are related to, and the end structures that they innervate. Now we are going to see the fifth nerve. The fifth nerve is the fifth cranial nerve is the largest of the cranial nerve that we have, and the longest cranial nerve is the vagus nerve, that is the 10th nerve. So the fifth nerve leaves the brainstem from the pons. It is a mixed type of cranial nerve. That means it will be having both the sensory component and a motor component. The sensory part has three branches, that is the ophthalmic division, the maxillary division, and the mandibular division. So it first leaves the brainstem at the pons, then they leave the cranial cavity through the ophthalmic division, leaves it through the superior orbital fissure. The maxillary division leaves the cranial cavity from the foramen rotundum. And the mandibular division plus the motor component leave the cranial cavity from the foramen oval. Now this fifth nerve is related to two nuclei. The first is the special visceral afferent, which carries its efferent fibers to the muscles developed from the first brachial arch. Muscles developed from the first brachial arch, that is the muscles of mastication. This is the motor component. And the sensory component, for the sensory component we have the trigeminal nuclei, which is a part of general somatic afferent. We have the trigeminal nuclei, which is again divided into the mesencephalic part, the primary, and the spinal. The mesencephalic part has the sensation of proprioception. The primary is responsible for touch, and the spinal is responsible for the pain and temperature. Right. Now we have the sixth nerve. In the sixth nerve, we had seen that there is only one nuclei, which is general somatic efferent, which carries its nerve fiber to the lateral rectus muscle. It leaves the brainstem from the pontomedullary junction. Being the most medial, it leaves the cranial cavity through the superior orbital fissure. And then it supplies the lateral rectus muscle. Then we have the seventh nerve. Seventh nerve is also known as facial nerve. So the facial nerve is related to the following nuclei. The first nuclei it is related to is the lacrimating nucleus. Which is the type of general visceral efferent nuclei. The second is salivatory nucleus, superior salivatory nucleus. Inferior is carried by the ninth nerve. The superior salivatory nucleus is carried by the seventh nerve, which is again a type of general visceral efferent. The third nucleus it is related to is the special visceral efferent nuclei of the seventh nerve, which carries its efferent nerve fibers to the muscles developed from the second brachial arch, that is the muscles of facial expression. Then it is related to the nucleus tractus solitarius. How is it related to the nucleus tractus solitarius? Because it carries the taste sensation from the tongue. Which part of the tongue? It carries the taste sensation from the anterior two-third as the chorda tympani. So the chorda tympani, which is a part of the facial nerve, carries the taste sensations from the anterior two-third part of the tongue to the nucleus tractus solitarius. Which part of the nucleus tractus solitarius? The superior part, right? And the last nucleus, which is related to the seventh nerve, is the trigeminal nuclei. How is it related to the trigeminal nuclei? Because it carries sensations from the auricular part, that is the ear. It leaves the brainstem from the pontomedullary junction lateral to the sixth nerve. It leaves the cranial cavity from the internal acoustic meatus. Right? So we have seen the 5 nuclei which are related to the seventh nerve. We have seen where is it related to the brainstem, and we have seen through which foramen in the base of the skull it leaves the cranial cavity, that is the internal acoustic meatus. Right? So now we see the eighth nerve. Eighth nerve is the vestibulocochlear nerve. It carries the sensations of hearing and balance from the vestibule and cochlea. So it is related to the vestibular nuclei and the cochlear nuclei, the dorsal and ventral cochlear nuclei. It is related to the brainstem. It leaves the brainstem from the pontomedullary junction, the most lateral part of the pontomedullary junction. And it leaves the cranial cavity to the internal acoustic meatus. Right? So we have the eighth nerve which is responsible for the hearing and balance. It is known as the vestibulocochlear nerve. So it must be carrying the fibers from the vestibule and the cochlea. We have 2 nuclei, the vestibular nuclei and 2 cochlear nuclei, that is the dorsal nuclei, dorsal cochlear nuclei and the ventral cochlear nuclei. So in total we have 3 nerves relating to the eighth nerve. It is associated with the brainstem. It leaves the brainstem from the pontomedullary junction, the most lateral, that is the sixth nerve is the most medial. Between the sixth and the eighth nerve we have the seventh nerve, and the eighth nerve is the most lateral part. It leaves the base of the skull through the internal acoustic meatus foramen. Now we have the ninth nerve. The ninth cranial nerve is also known as the glossopharyngeal nerve. The glossopharyngeal nerve is related to the following nuclei. The first is the inferior salivatory nucleus. The inferior salivatory nucleus, the fibers from the inferior salivatory nucleus are carried towards the otic ganglion, from where the fibers arise and innervate the parotid gland. This is the type of general visceral efferent nuclei. Then it is related to the nucleus ambiguus, which is a type of special visceral efferent because it innervates the muscles developed from third, fourth and sixth brachial arches. Then it is related to the nucleus tractus solitarius. How is it related to the nucleus tractus solitarius? Because it carries the taste sensations from the posterior one third, The anterior two-third of the tongue was innervated by the chorda tympani, which was the part of facial nerve. The taste sensation from the posterior one-third is carried by the ninth nerve, that is the glossopharyngeal nerve. So it again innervates the superior part of the nucleus tractus solitarius. Then also it carries the sensation from the carotid sinus and carotid body. Which innervates the middle medial part of the nucleus tractus solitarius. And the last nerve and the last nucleus which the glossopharyngeal nerve is related to is the trigeminal nuclei. Why? Because it carries the sensations from ear. It carries the auricular sensations. So the ninth cranial nerve is related to four nuclei. The first is the inferior salivatory nucleus, which the fibers from which are carried to the otic ganglion, and finally they innervate the parotid gland. The second nucleus the ninth nerve is related to is the nucleus ambiguus, which is a type of special visceral efferent nuclei, and it innervates the muscles developed from the third, fourth, and sixth brachial arches. Then the third nerve, the ninth nerve is related. The third nucleus the ninth nerve is related to is the nucleus tractus solitarius. Why? Because the ninth nerve carries the taste sensations and the sensations from the carotid sinus and the carotid body, and they end up in the nucleus tractus solitarius. The taste sensation from the posterior one-third is carried and it is ended into the superior part of the nucleus tractus solitarius, and the sensations from the carotid sinus and the carotid body is carried to the middle medial part of the nucleus tractus solitarius. And the last nuclei to which the ninth nerve is related to is the trigeminal nuclei. It is related to the trigeminal nuclei because it carries the auricular sensations from the ear. Right? So now how is it related to the brainstem? It is related to the brainstem as it leaves the brainstem from the post olivary sulcus, and it leaves the cranial cavity through jugular foramen. Which are the nerves that leave through the jugular foramen? The ninth nerve, the 10th nerve, and the 11th nerve. Now we will see about the 10th cranial nerve. 10th cranial nerve is also known as the vagus. It is related to the following nuclei. First, the dorsal nucleus of vagus. It is related. The second nuclei which the 10th nerve is related to is the nucleus ambiguus, which is a type of special visceral afferent. It carries its fibers to the muscles developed from the third, fourth, and sixth brachial arches. The third nerve it is related. The third nuclei it is related to it is the nucleus tractus solitarius. Why? Because it carries the signal from all of the viscera. And the last nuclei it is related to is the trigeminal nuclei. The fibers arising from the dorsal nucleus of vagus has a heavy parasympathetic supply to all the rest of the body. That means it has a parasympathetic supply to all the viscera of the body. The second nucleus, nucleus ambiguus, it is related to the nucleus ambiguus as it carries the motor commands to the muscles developed from the brachial arches, that is the muscles of pharynx and larynx. Then it is related to the nucleus tractus solitarius. Why? Because it carries the sensations from the posterior mode past of the tongue and from the viscera of the body. The trigeminal nuclei because it carries the auricular sensations. right? So there are four nuclei relating to the 10th nerve, that is the dorsal nucleus of vagus, which has a heavy parasympathetic supply throughout the body. The next nucleus is the nucleus ambiguous, which has the nerve innervation, the efferent nerve innervations to the muscles developed from the brachial arches, that is the larynx and pharyngeal muscles. The third nucleus is the nucleus tractus solitarius. Why? Because it carries the sensations from the posterior most part of the tongue and the viscera of the body to the nucleus tractus solitarius, and also it carries the auricular sensations from the ear. So these are the four nuclei. The 10th nerve is related to. From the brainstem, it leaves from the post auricular sulcus and it leaves the cranial cavity through the jugular foramen. Then we have the 11th nerve. 11th nerve is also called as the spinal accessory nerve. It has two components, spinal and cranial. The cranial part of the spinal accessory nerve leaves from the post olivary sulcus and the spinal part originates from the spinal cord. Right? The 11th nerve leaves the cranial cavity through jugular foramen. It is related to the nucleus ambiguous. Why? Because it carries the sensations to the muscle developed from the brachial arches. And lastly, we have the 12th cranial nerve, which is a motor nerve, and it has its sensation to the hypoglossal muscle, which means it is related to only the 12th cranial nerve nuclei, which is a part of general somatic efferent system. It leaves the brainstem from the pre-olivary sulcus. Pre-olivary sulcus is located between the pre-olivary sulcus is located between the pyramid and the olive. And it leaves the cranial cavity through the hypoglossal canal located at the base of the skull. Right? So we have completed all the cranial nerve and all the cranial nerve nuclei that these cranial nerves are related to. We have seen from which portion of the brainstem these nuclei leave it, and from which foramen of the base of the skull these cranial nerves leave the cranial cavity. We have also seen the first and the second cranial nerve, which are not related to the brainstem but are related to the telencephalon and diencephalon. Respectively, the first cranial part is related to the telencephalon and the second cranial nerve is related to the diencephalon. Right? So here we complete all the cranial nerve and the cranial nerve nuclei. Thank you.